Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Orkney International Science Festival. It's great to see you here. This afternoon, we have a great talk from Professor Stuart Galloway, who has come to talk about changing lives with solar power. Stuart is from Strathclyde University's Global Renewables Centre. He's a professor at the University of Strathclyde, specialising in novel electrical power systems for transport and grid applications. He's the Energy Director of Scotland's Climate Exchange, that is connecting climate researchers with Scottish policymakers, technical advisor on community demonstrator projects for Local Energy Scotland, chair of the Scotland-Malawi Partnerships Energy Forum, and through the Global Renewables Centre, he leads the Scottish Government's renewables projects in Africa. So today, Professor Galloway is speaking about how Strathclyde University's Global Renewables Centre is helping communities in several African countries to set up their own local energy systems.
Thank you, Barbara. Hopefully you can hear me okay and the microphone's working okay. So thank you very much, everybody, for the kind invitation along to speak this afternoon at the Science Festival. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some work that we've undertaken at the university, which is linked with international development and in particular in relation to renewable energy and because it's in Africa, particularly related to solar power. So let me begin by finding the clicker thing for moving the slides on. So yes, there we go. So let me just get back to the start. So I think what I'd like to do to begin with is just to sort of set the scene a little bit, maybe a little bit of education with some numbers and why maybe Africa in particular has got some particular interest in developing like renewable energy solutions. And but as part of that, it's not just a technical solution. There is things that we're maybe terminology and some sort of scene setting that we'd use in and around sustainable development. So I think this is a term that people hear quite a lot, and it means a few things really, but there's a little bit of a general definition there. But I did look up the principles of sustainable development ahead of this talk, partly just because I was worried you would ask me a question, but I thought it would just maybe be helpful for us all just to mention it. So the actual principles in relation to this are about the conservation of the ecosystem or the environment, the conservation of biodiversity for the planet, sustainable development of society, the conservation of human resources, and population control and management. So there's those 5 principles, either in their entirety or in part, are the things that feed into that sustainable development sort of narrative. And when you're looking to try and do projects and it's got sustainability linked with it, it touches on one or more of those things. So I'm just posting those with you. They're not something you need to sort of particularly remember. I just wanted to set that aside. So the other thing that you might be quite familiar with, or at least have heard of, is the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So way back in something like 2012, they were trying to, at various sort of scientific UN-related meetings, they were trying to bring together kind of coherence around the multiplicity of areas where people were trying to produce things that linked with sustainable development. And of course, there's a huge range of these things that it touches upon. So by about 2015 or so, the UN had landed on these 17 areas where they could capture elements where there was some sustainable development aspects that needed pursued. So the framing around these 17 goals is they all set their own targets against each of these different headings. And you can see, I'm sure, that they're quite diverse. So they've got targets of what they're hoping to achieve by 2015. So that was 15 years from 2015 out to 2030, sorry. And yeah, so if you looked into these in a little bit more detail, I mean, there's things on fuel poverty, things on partnerships. Each of them have got sort of perspectives. But the thing to remember is that they apply to everybody. This is for in developed countries and in developing countries. So it feels like sometimes when you hear about these things, it's always somewhere else, but they also apply here. It's just what we need to do and what we do in and around these things varies. So it varies by location. So yeah, I'm going to focus in particular on things that are linked with Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which is about widening energy access. So you can shoot for that Sustainable Development Goal. The sort of strap line really is to ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all, and that's through to 2030. And here we have in Scotland, we have really high quality of access to energy resources. For some people, that will be just electricity. For others, it'll be a mixture of gas and electricity or renewable energy. So it varies here what people have as much as it varies elsewhere. And I want to also draw your attention to the fact that although this talks about providing access to energy, it also highlights renewables and energy efficiency as being two parts of this, and these bring additional constraints in some cases about what people are actually trying to achieve. So I just thought I'd highlight that one in particular. And really, how can I put this? There's a phrase really about electricity sometimes being considered as the golden thread that passes through all the different sustainable development goals in one form or another as a key enabler for many of the other aspects. So often when you're talking about energy and giving people access to energy, what that primarily means is often access to electricity in different forms. So a little bit more on energy access. So the big thing for Sustainable Development Goal number 7 is access to energy. And in the African setting, that's access to clean electricity to support the goals of sustainable development. So in the Scottish context for access, so here we are largely concerned, in Scotland, we're largely concerned about the connection of renewable energy sources to the existing electrical network. Whereas in Africa and other developing countries, sometimes it's about providing that network or providing other resources that allow them to achieve those SDG 7 things. But the key thing to remember is it's applying to all of us in slightly different ways. And so in the following slides, I'm going to just give you a few statistics that'll help you will help us really narrow in on why are we so concerned about what's happening in Africa, and in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, why that's very important. So, yeah. So in this chart, not a very exciting graph, I don't think, but it tells you, what it's telling us is what percentage of the population has access to energy. So, whoops, excuse me, clicking too soon. So that is, some of that is actual numbers, but right at the end, it's a forecast out to 2030. So if we take it one part at a time, the blue line shows the baseline for 2000, the year 2000. And at that point, so 24 years ago, 78% of the planet had access to some form of energy. It's not necessarily the same, the energy we have here, but they had access to some form of energy, and in particular electricity. So then if you move it on another 10 years, 6% more people 84% people could access some form of energy at that stage. So that's moving in the right direction. That's servicing the Sustainable Development Goal number 7 about providing more and more access. So, and again, if you bump it on another 10 or so years, you get 7% more being added, 91% access to energy, and so on. But that last part, the part in red, which takes us up to a forecast to 2030, the growth has slowed. And you can see that they're only forecasting 1% growth between 2022, which I know is behind us, but out to 2030. So that seems strange, and we really could have done another bump on another 10%. But something's going on there that's stopping this from happening. So I just want to post that with you. That's something that needs looked at. On this next chart, we're trying to look at something that's going in the opposite direction. In the previous slide, we were looking for things to grow up. That could go up. That was people's access to energy. Here, we're looking at the population who don't have access to energy. So we want that to go down, because if they don't have access, if we have, yeah, so it's going down basically. So you can see here that, I don't know if you can read the sort of countries along the bottom, but some parts of the globe have made really big progress in this area, particularly in Southeast Asia. You can see the yellow part of the curve, it's going down. So the people without access to energy is going down. So in other words, more people are getting access to energy. But if you look at some of the other colours, I want to draw your attention in particular to the green, but I mean the grey for the rest of the world, and also the blue and so on. But in particular for sub-Saharan Africa, it has stagnated. It's not grown, it's not decreased, it's just stayed the same. Now that is despite effort. What's not happened is that people have just been signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals and then sat on their hands. They've been very active in trying to promote grid access and so forth, and developing things, but it hasn't made any difference. But why is that? That seems strange. So this is one of the reasons why there is so much emphasis put on countries in Africa, but in particular in sub-Saharan Africa, because it really is not shifting. And the reason behind this is to do with population growth. So although people are gaining more access to energy, the growth in the population in sub-Saharan Africa is outstripping this. So in other words, population numbers are going up. They are slowly providing access to energy for people. And the net result is it's not really changing who's got access. So this is one of the challenges where that technical solution for providing energy needs to be accelerated. The last chart I wanted to show you, I'm sorry for showing you loads of charts really, is part of the solution for helping accelerate energy from a technological point of view at least, as posted out by the International Energy Authority. So this is just for Africa, and what you can see in this pie chart is the results of some studies that they did. They ran the modelling exercises. They looked at the different access levels you could achieve under different scenarios for different blends of electricity access. And these three things were really giving people access to the grid, giving people building and constructing mini grids, and also providing standalone power solutions. So, and if you did that under this scenario, and they run many scenarios, most I think which will have failed to achieve 100% access by 2030, in this particular case, they were able to say, well, you could do these things in these proportions, and in sub-Saharan Africa, this could help you achieve the 100% target by 2030. So what this tells you is a number of things, really, but one thing is that the grid electricity, the expansion of the existing electricity grid to reach out to these people who don't have access to electricity isn't going to deliver all of that. It'll fail in doing it. It'll get some of them, but not all of them. So instead, the others are being picked up by these mini grids and standalone systems. And it's the mini grids, the orange and the yellow, which represent 31%, and they're the largest chunk that are going to help to achieve some of that energy access. So that's another reason why some of the work that's going on is focusing on mini grid development, and this is globally, but also in sub-Saharan Africa. So they're the two pieces basically that are key to this talk. Another bit that slightly strengthens that argument is this graph here shows where people are located and the distance that they are from getting a grid connection. So in this case, if you live between 0 and 5 kilometers from somewhere where you could reasonably expect to get access to the electricity grid, then in that case, 60-70% of people are going to actually get grid access at some point, and there's a small number of those who are on standalone and mini grid solutions. excuse me. But then the further you get away from the grid, the less economic or perhaps technical, but more normally economic that becomes to provide. So the network's reaching out. It also doesn't really develop that quickly either. It takes time for it to develop. So the further away you are from the grid, the more likely you are to be connected to a mini grid or on a standalone power system that you might have access to. And that again is another reason for why we're looking at these systems, because the customers who are over here, particularly those who are close to the network utility is going to pick them up sometime soon. Okay? So maybe I should say that in Scotland, we're largely all connected to the main electricity grid, but few people are not. And sometimes those who are not are on the fringes of the network, or they're in a situation where they've separated themselves from the network intentionally, and they're running their own standalone mini grid or power system, basically. So it's not that I'm trying to make sure there's a connection here between what's happening in Scotland as well as what's happening partly in Africa. So it's not unknown for here, it's just not very typical because we've got a very good and widespread electrical network. But there are some places, in Scotland, the Summer Isles, for example, where they have their own systems. But they're not necessarily very much led by solar. So the impact of access. So there is a big need really to get this, to help deliver on Sustainable Development Goal number 7, there's a big need to provide that access to electricity. That's going to come in a number of different forms. There's a particular need in sub-Saharan Africa to really get this stuff moving. But mini grids are going to largely be the solution for this, rather than people being grid connected. So let me show you a little bit more. I'm very sorry that there's lots of graphs. There'll be some nice pictures soon, I promise you. So in this case, this shows you a little bit about how much electricity people typically consume per person along the bottom here. And it's also plotted against the GDP for different countries. And although there's a lot of data on here, really what you want to try and take from it is that, and the sub-Saharan African countries are shown in red, is that the large majority of sub-Saharan African countries largely are at the bottom end, so they've got low-ish gross domestic products, but they've also, per capita, per person, they don't have much electricity, they don't have access or use much electricity. So I appreciate there's other data you could look at, but here there's a correlation between the amount of electricity you use and what the GDP for your country is. And these SSA countries, sub-Saharan African countries, are in the lower end of that typically. So that's something to keep in mind. This graph uses a thing called the Human Development Index, but what it's that's on the vertical scale, but what it's trying to capture is an econometric measure, but what it's trying to capture is a balance between these three words in the middle, about how prosperous countries or people are, what the level of education is in those countries, and how long people live, what their, the lifespan is. And it's sort of mashed into one number, a number that's typically less than 1, which is called the HDI, Human Development Index. And then that's been plotted here against annual electricity use. So again, you can see that when electricity use is low, you get these low HDI numbers. So you're getting in those countries, and this data is slightly out of date. I expect China to be further up, for example. But you're getting, for people who've got per person low electricity use, they're getting this score which is reflective of low levels of prosperity, low levels of education in those countries, and typically a shorter lifespan in some ratio, basically. So what you're trying to do, and this is oversimplifying it slightly, is if you could give people more access to energy, and in this case electricity, it could move them along that line a bit, or that curve, that non-linear curve. And the idea really is not to move them all the way to the end, like America. It's to try to get them in that knee point where they get a real benefit, but then beyond that, it's more marginal benefit, I suppose. Excuse me, well. So something to be had there. So access to energy can help with national figures, but it can also help with individual well-being. Sustainable energy systems. I've mentioned 2 or 3 times about grid connection, and by which I mean main grid. I've mentioned a thing called standalone systems, and I've mentioned a thing called a mini grid. So I thought I'd show you some pictures of what they looked like, so it's putting that in your head a bit more clearly, because they are kind of key components of this. So these are just some examples. So when you talk about standalone systems, normally it's one of these top two, sorry. So I'll talk about a solar home system in a little bit more detail, but it could be anything from what's called a solar lantern. So just a light like this, but a little solar panel on the top of it, and that's what its power source is. And it's a very, very small device that provides, runs on a few watts, but can provide, a real base layer of energy. Then you get a solar home system, which is a slightly more interconnected system, but the energy comes from a solar panel and it can power 2 or 3 pieces of demand. You've got a mini grid, which would help support a community, let's say, or a small group of customers. And then you've got the national grid, which we are more familiar with. So looking again in a sort of bit more detail, the solar home system typically looks like this. So you saw that solar panel on the outside of the roof of that house. That's your generation source. There's a piece of technology which with inside that really is a battery, which is shown at the bottom, so a little bit of storage. Then you've got an inverter and you've got something for recording some of the data. But what that allows you to do is power a limited number of loads. But that is typically on an individual premises basis, one per house. Okay? One per house. So that's a standalone system. The difference between that standalone system and a mini grid is that you have an interconnected system where you've got perhaps different generation sources. So it could be a mixture of solar or wind or micro hydro. Some other options are down the bottom here. But you also have something on some controls and management on the network, which is helping you match the electricity generation with the things that you're using energy for. But this is groups of houses typically. So it's at a bigger scale and groups of houses. And this is an example of one which is in an African village. This is just the generation source and also the hub. So you've got solar panels that are sitting on top of that. Solar panel array. You've got inside that box, that's where you keep the control system and maybe some of the measurements. And then in this case, the cables that run to the loads of people's homes are undergrounded. So they're running underground rather than on poles. It might not look it, but it's quite high tech, but it's also deliverable and you can construct it there, and people who are there can do this themselves with a bit of expertise or expert input. But I think maybe a key point really is that giving people access to energy in itself is not the end point. The way the SDGs are written, particularly for SDG 7, is about providing 100% access. But people are going to enter that at different levels depending on their circumstances, where they are, the political climate, a whole factor of things really. So arguably, you could make all of these different cases, starting off from that solar lantern case to off-grid, mini-grid and main grid. If you're doing well in this, people are going to enter at one of those points and get access to energy. But they will also look to develop. So although the Sustainable Development Goals are set a target for 2030, it goes way beyond that. You're going to have to move people through these things. So I've given a sort of example there of the types of demand that could be supported. So for an off-grid case in a home, you might be able to do lighting, perhaps have a radio or a mobile phone charging. Then on a mini grid, slightly more larger scale loads, and then off main grid, something we're familiar with ourselves. But I've also highlighted down the bottom a thing which is referred to as productive uses of energy. And these are often linked with either a business or productive processes that might be happening nearby, which will have their own energy demands. So in these situations, and often if you're developing mini-grids, you're kind of looking for these things nearby if you can, because it allows you to upscale and make the grid a bit larger with more capacity, because you're trying to service some of these loads here, agricultural loads or what have you, and that can help the community that's pinned on the back of it. So that's another mechanism for scaling people up. Yeah. And lastly, this has brought about a sort of terminology for what access people get to energy. So there's a tiers of access. I've shown them along the bottom there, and that's sort of what you can expect depending on what tier of access you're in. So if you've got no electricity, then your options are genuinely candles or burning kerosene, a paraffin lamp or something. That's going to be your lighting source. One kick up from that is tier 1, where you've got these pico solar products, these tiny wee milliwatt products, and then it goes up in scale. Now, another assumption, and something that people think who are connected to these systems, is once they get access to them, it'll just be perfect. In practical terms, the reliability of the systems is very poor. And so even at sort of the grid scale, you're still going to get regular outages. And that can be in countries who are, let's say, like very poor countries as well as quite developed countries. It just varies quite a lot where you're based, I think, really, and what sort of investments have been made. So I just want to give you a sense of this, but the idea, again, going back to that sustainable development goal thing, is you would enter one of these, wherever you are right now, you would be in one of these levels of access that given time, things would improve. Okay, so SDG is not the end. So now that you're experts in international energy development, I've given you all the background to it, you understand a little bit what some of the challenges are, why there's a particular challenge in I was going to say in Edinburgh, but let's say Africa instead. In Africa, and what some of the solutions could be that are going to best make impact on that. That's the kind of start point. And I think I want to tell you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing, really, at the university. So this is not something that just happened overnight. We've been involved in renewable development projects for over a decade. And in doing so, we've been able to build up a good understanding, a good level of partnerships, and also to help bring some of these things on quite well. They've been significantly supported by Scottish Government's International Development Team. They've got a particular link with Malawi, but it also extends to Rwanda and Zambia. And so you can see for the projects that I've been involved in, this is kind of the timeline. And there's people who, some of you maybe who live on Orkney, who are maybe involved in the Emerite project, who are linked with Community Energy Scotland, who are one of the key partners in Emerite. But one of the key things that came out of that Emerite project, these were all about advancing the use of renewables in different ways, basically. But two things came out of the Emerite project, really, which was the formation of Community Energy Malawi, which is a kind of sister organisation for Community Energy Scotland, and also a group called, let me think, District Energy Officers. So this was a kind of role that was created. So you had kind of outreach workers who were basically communicating the value of renewable energy and how that could be brought in to be productively into different sort of communities. So it was kind of like, so that was a good advocacy that was taken on board. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the EASE project, which I've just noticed was a typo because it actually finished this year in 2024, because I think that's our most evolved version of this. So EASE, which is easy to say, but it stands for Rural Energy Access Through Social Enterprise and Decentralisation. It's primarily aimed at Sustainable Development Goal number 7, which is about providing access to energy. But it also touches to a greater or lesser extent on some of these other Sustainable Development Goals. So that kind of goes back to the statement I was making about electricity being a bit of the golden thread that passes through many of these different things. So in this situation, in this project rather, we were constructing mini grids to provide people with access to energy. I'll give you some statistics of what that was. We were using the district energy officer role that we'd created, so it created some jobs, and people were going out and telling people about the opportunities that having access to electricity, like mini grid electricity, would bring. But we also set up these energy hubs, sort of like the picture you've already seen, but we'll see a little bit more of a little better version of those in a second. But they were specifically aimed at providing energy to businesses. So they were the purpose of usually was to create these businesses off the back of giving people access to solar energy. So we provide the energy hub with the solar power, provide connections to people who want to start new businesses, and then they use that they start their business to access the electricity to generate some income. And from that income, we basically ran a social enterprise where the community was basically running their own energy system, essentially. So these were some of our partners. So Strathclyde, obviously, Self-Help Africa used to be called United Purpose, but they've changed their name quite recently. Community Energy Malawi, and also Washted. So that's the basis for what we were trying to do. These are the things we've done. I'll let you read some of those things. So set up some grids, set up these energy kiosks for providing energy to different businesses, worked to help support some of the formations of other people's energy hubs. And in total, we basically built, through that 4 years of the EASE project, we built 4 of these mini grids that helped support a number of different community groups. And there you go. So quite a few people. During COVID, there was a bit of a crisis, as we all had a crisis during COVID. But in particular, some of the hospitals in Malawi, rural hospitals, were absolutely overrun by refugees coming across the border looking for medical care and so on. So we were able to kind of help mobilize things a little bit and use the same contractors that we'd used in Malawi to help build these very simple PV systems that really made a difference in these hospitals. So anyway, I'm purposely staying away from telling you too much detail because I've got a nice video which explains it a bit better. You could say, how well placed were we to do this? So we had that long involvement, we had good partnerships, but there is no substitute for actually engaging with the people who are involved, who are going to be the end users of the energy. So there's a very much kind of community focus and a community buy-in into the solutions that we developed. There are literally thousands of abandoned renewables projects in Africa, thousands in individual countries where people have just turned up, provided a solution, and for a variety of reasons, it's just not been adopted, or maybe it stopped working and nobody can fix it. So the right thing to do, and what we did, was we spoke to the people who were going to be the end users and used them to try and identify what their needs were, what their requirements were, and really where they wanted to go, if they had access to energy. So anyway, you can see we did quite a lot of different consultation. We also, you could say, I think this is my last graph, by the way. You'll be very pleased because we're going to see a video next. Why is a university doing this, you could ask? So I think that one of the reasons for that, why are we involved so much, is because it's not clear exactly what you should do. What is the right business model that you should use to set up these mini grids and operate them? How should you involve people? How long, what role should they play? What are the right technical solutions? So, there's questions that are around that, and universities are good at exploring these things. So we're not claiming to be the lead on these. We're a partner as part of a team which involves the community to try and understand these things. So although we've done some of these projects and we've done some evaluations, you can see some of the survey results there about the satisfaction of getting access to energy. We want to try and scale these things up, and I'll say a few things about that in a little while. So anyway, now let's see if I can get this to work. Oh.
The EASE project is bringing energy access to rural communities through connection to electricity. Behind me is a solar microgrid. It is 12 kilowatt in size, and it is providing wired connections to 60 customers in this village. For rural communities, if you don't have reliable access to light, like in the evening, people are forced to cook early, to go to bed early, so it reduces their time of productivity. For businesses, they have to close early because they don't have access to reliable lighting sources.
Ndipo pamene zoona kuti chowunikira tochi ndi imodzi. Ndikuti tochi yomwe imafunika ipite ku kitchen, tikawunikire tiphike, tidye, anaso afuna kuti akawerenge. Zimakhala zovuta ndi thumbuyomu kuti ana azikhoza bwino ku sukulu. Tibwera, peza kuti ndape imene tikayipeza kumene kuja, imathanso kugula chakudya kuti ana adye pa khomo. Koma amene adabwera magesimu, ndikutha kuti moyo wanga udasintha ndi chifukwa kuti ndimawunikira m'nyumbamo, ana amawerenga bwinobwino, komanso kunja kuli babu limene limanditetezera kunja anthu akuba, amachita bwino kwambiri class chifukwa kuti akumawerenga.
So in order to use the energy, the site agents get to a website on their smartphone, and then they do a top-up for the customer. The smart meters also enables the customers to check their balance. We are also able to gather data on energy demand, load profiles, payment frequencies, as well as other technical parameters. And this data will be made available to the wider mini-grid sector in Malawi. One of the highlights from this project is that we've been able to connect the primary school to the grid, and we give them free units every month. Through that, we've seen that the teachers are able to prepare their lessons at school, as well as having access to electronic teacher guidebooks. And also with the availability of electricity, a lot of children are coming for the evening classes.
We have seen some differences in the performance of the runners. Last year, out of 44, 7 got selected to go to Central School. After the introduction of this electricity in 2020, out of 47 learners, 38 got selected to go to Central School. That's a very good number.
For businesses, we've grocery shops which are now able to use fridges. They are able now to sell cold drinks and increase their income. They have also been able to increase their trading hours because previously they used to close their business much early. The microgrid will be owned and managed through a social enterprise, but we still have spare capacity to connect even more users, more especially daytime users. It's going to offer a wider portfolio of energy services in Malawi, so they might include further microgrids as well as energy kiosks. Electricity is important because it acts as an enabler. So at village level, it improves the quality of life at domestic level, and it also brings a lot of opportunities for local income generation in the community.
Elizabeth says it much better than I do, really, but hopefully you got a sense of some of the things we'd already talked about there, and you could see some of it in action, I think. I've already been told I've only got 5 minutes left, so I'll very briefly say a couple of other things. So you might rightly say, so what next? You've helped out a few villages in Africa. That's really great, but actually that's just the start of the challenge. So really, scaling things up is the key. That's the key for everybody, all the way through from us, all the way through to the World Bank. They're all trying to think about how they try and address some of these things. One thing that we're leading on for Scottish Government is this sort of global, they call it their Global Renewables Centre. So I'm the academic director for that. And that's the idea there really, is to connect people from the international development partner countries for Scottish Government with expertise and relevant parties in Scotland primarily. And so it's a knowledge exchange activity. These are our kind of mission things about connecting, exploring, looking for the right solutions, and basically sharing that learning. That's what this is supposed to do. And we've had quite a lot of success. We're really just getting going with it, but we've had quite a lot of interest. I thought I'd tell you very briefly a little bit about some of the background for some of these countries, because we've talked about levels of access and so on. So Malawi, Zambia and Rwanda are the 3 international development partner countries for Scottish government in Africa. They've got other interests internationally, but they're the 3 countries. They're big. It would be fair to say that the strongest connection is in Malawi, because I spent most time doing things there for well over a decade, as you saw by some of the investments in those projects that I was talking about, amongst many other things that they do in that area. So it's not just about energy. There's a lot of healthcare stuff in agriculture, dentistry, policing, nursing, and so on. But so if you look at where these countries are at, they're all at sort of different stages in terms of their energy access. Malawi, which is the poorest of these countries, 14.2% of the population have got access to electricity. Then you've got Zambia, nearly half. Rwanda, doing pretty well at 77. They've got different sets of resources. So if you look at the installed capacity, how much generation is already in the countries at the bottom there, 400 megawatts, 3,000 megawatts, and 332 megawatts. Zambia is by far got the most investment in generation sources, the things that generate the power at a large scale embedded in the country. It has a lot of mining interests. There's a lot of their economies based around mining. They need access to a lot of energy. So you see these sort of disproportionate balances. Rwanda's a very small country comparatively, and they've had a chance to basically go way along this list. So not only do 77% of the people have access to electricity, they've already got this quite evolved solution where there's a balance of main grid and mini grid. And their challenge is trying to get those sort of the remaining customers connected. So everybody's at slightly different sorts of start points, let's say from the point of view of the Global Renewables Centre, including Scotland. I mentioned at the beginning that our challenges are not about access to energy, but the challenges for Scotland is connecting new renewables into our existing network. That's what the challenge seems to be. And at the moment, we're doing pretty well about that, but maybe you know a lot about offshore wind and things. There's a lot more to come, and that'll bring its own challenges. But we also have community off-grid local renewables that are, somewhere in the system. That's sort of highlighting some of the community energy, which I know is a big thing on Orkney, but it's also all the way across Scotland. So the idea here is to share learning between all of these partners at lots of different levels, from academia, technical expertise, NGOs. I've had lots of phone calls from schools, primary schools, who've set up a partnership with a school in Malawi to get some advice on how they could help them install solar panels on the roof of their school. So I'm not trying to take myself out of that loop, but even at that scale, I want to be able to use the Global Renewables Centre as a pathway for that. So I know Barbara's going to tell me off in a second, but we've set up links with the renewable energy organisations, partnerships in each of these 3 countries, and they're our conduit for doing things. I'll maybe skip that. We had them visit us here in Scotland so that they got to know us, we got to know them, and we went on a bit of a tour around some academic institutions, so other universities. We met some NGOs, we met some companies, and they got to meet these people because at the end of the day, we're trying to make a connection here, and it's not just an intangible thing through a website. There's people at the other end of this. So here's some of the people that came and visited. These 2 semi-handsome guys at the back are my 2 researchers, Aaron and Damien, and they took them around. So this is a community energy project. It's for a micro hydro scheme that they went to visit, which was sponsored by the government's CARES programme. Went to visit Glasgow Calais, Dundee University, and so on. Bit of a trip. Met the people of the Scottish Government International Development Team in the right-hand corner. But these are the people that are going to be working as part of the Global Renewables Centre in Zambia, Malawi, and Rwanda, and they'll be our conduit. So just to be clear, there is things that are already going on in these countries. We're not trying to create that. What we're trying to do is amplify it by working together with them. So what's happening there? How can we help support it? What do we know from them that we can bring back to Scotland? It's an absolutely 2-way process that we're trying to foster. So that's a version of what I just said. we've also been, visiting and making a big splash, as it were, in these different countries. So we've attended some conferences which have been attended, and they're not just academic conferences, they've been attended at ministerial level in each of the 3 countries, all the way down to meeting the people who are linked in with the Renewable Energy Association. So it's not, I know everybody thinks academics are always going to wonderful conferences, and obviously here's a wonderful conference in Orkney, but it's a bit more than that. We've been using this as real outreach and getting visibility for what we're doing. So they're very, very well attended, and there's a lot of engagement and for them to try and do more what they need to do. And they've got the challenges. They've got the challenges. So this is a little bit on our priorities for the GRC, but I think that's maybe not so good. This is how to get in touch with us. So if you're interested, then please do get in touch. We'd be pleased to tell you more about this, about the work we're already undertaking, the work we plan to do, and maybe your expertise or people you know, maybe they would like to know more about it. So I think I'll probably finish there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to taking some questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Stuart. That was so interesting. And I'm sorry you didn't have more time. But that was fantastic. And we have, set aside time for questions. We've got a roving mic down here, and I think we've got one up at the top as well. So if anyone has any questions. Right, one up at the top there. Thanks. And this is another way you can ask questions if you want to scan the QR code or use the Slido.
Hi. End user affordability is an increasing issue in even places like the UK, obviously.
Yes.
How is that overcome, or what's being done to try and overcome it in places like Africa and the other countries that are developing?
Yeah. So I think that's a good question, actually, because the social enterprise that we've set up requires the people who are using the energy to pay back a bit in. So, I mean, the mechanics of it is there's a bit of a calculation that's done, which looks at, how much is needed, what's affordable, how much do you estimate you need to maintain a standard, a mini grid, and then try and push that over a 15-year period, and then look at the figures to see if that is affordable, basically. So the alternative to providing some of the energy is that from the mini grid system is that money would be spent on something else. It could be spent on charcoal or a number of different things. So you're just sort of trying to divert it a little bit, but the prices are set at an affordable level based on these sorts of assessments, and that also includes, understanding how much energy people are actually using. A lot of the issues are about the lack of actual metering sometimes for a system, so you're not really sure how much is being used, who's using it, when they're using it, and so the prices are set in a mixture of all these things. A bit of technical, a bit of ongoing support, and then there's a bit of a question around affordability. I mean, the prices that people pay or get to a stage where they pay them on the social enterprise, they're not going to cover the capital costs of the equipment, but they're going to cover the ongoing cost for energy. And our ambition is for these businesses, I know this is what we've kind of realised, that they can afford to pay their own electricity and pay their way. So they get access to energy. From that, they make a profit out of the business that they're doing, and some of that comes back. So that's what we're trying to get, that balance, basically. So I'm not sure if that fully helps answer your question, but
It does. It's slightly a concern, I guess, that energy debt becomes an issue for an individual or a new start business in these.
Yeah. So again, we don't have anybody in any of our systems who's in that position, but we've made a dispensation for it by engaging the community group. So there's a process that we would enter if that was the case. So, there's an equivalent you mentioned Scotland, there's an equivalent process if you go into energy debt here, basically, about how that would be managed and recovered. So there's an equivalent process that's there, but it's been put in place with the consumers in mind and their needs, really. The school gets free electricity, for example. So you could say that, it's a bit of, that's not generating any income, but it's actually a very good thing for the wider community. You can see that it's a really purposeful thing to do. there. So there's a, again, as I say, there's a trade-off between things. Thank you. Hi there.
For the future, what do you see as a priority?
Well,
Local grids or building large infrastructure, national grids in these places?
I think it will vary from country to country in Africa. I think not just the three that we've been talking about this afternoon. I mean, it's sometimes, look at, remember the figures I put up for energy access at the end. Although Rwanda's doing very well there, to try and capture that remaining, 20 or 30% will cost quite a lot of money. Sometimes it's difficult to get the ones right at the last few, because they're often the last few because they're so far away from the grid, or they're, at the top of a mountain or there's challenges that are there that kind of make it quite difficult. But I think with the tiers of energy access in mind that I mentioned, it's a kind of onward thing. So one of the villages that we were working with, I think, Southern Bakel or Deads are the two places that were mentioned there on the slides. They are typically subsistence farmers, so they grow their crops, but the mechanism for doing that is they grow their crops, but then once they harvest the crops, a lot of harvesting going on in Scotland at the moment, they get sent away and they are processed and milled, and it's only at that point they work out how much maize you've got, so they go to a third party. So we'd quite like to add in a maize milling capability into one of their villages to create another productive load, basically. And I think that will help them possibly be more profitable. So that's just the one example. So it's kind of continuing, but the model is not to just grow the grids indefinitely. There will be a balance that you can reasonably support economically, commercially, and financially, I think.
Okay, thanks very much. Any other questions? Oh, there's one here. While we're waiting for that. No, it's there.
Question about really the future. Do you sort of see almost like a phase 2 to some of this, where at the moment when you're targeting sort of microgrid installations, clearly there'll be some sort of lifespan to those.
Yep.
And whether you're just looking for a like-for-like replacement, or you're really starting to think, well, by the time that comes to the end of its capital cycle, or well, not even capital cycle, it's productive, useful lifespan.
Yeah.
You're probably then thinking potentially about wider scale distribution or whatever. I'm sort of interested in your thoughts for the future.
I think it's a very good question. Again, I'm sorry to not be definitive, because I think there'll be a variety of situations, but either you construct some mini grid, people are using it effectively, and then there might be a change in circumstances. So there might be a change in the loading, or it could be a main grid connection appears, and they've got the opportunity to connect into the main grid. So what I'd like to see is that they construct these mini grids in such a way that they can be connected into the main grid if and when it arrives, and they can help support that grid, because what has often happened is the main grid appears, the mini grid gets bulldozed, and everybody gets access to the main grid basically, and then the grid company just moves on. So I think more sort of planning built into the planning process from a grid operator's point of view, how they could best make use of the systems that are there at the edge of the network productively, either for the people that are there or for the main grid itself, and then doing so inform what the grid developers, the requirements that they need to meet. So they should build for the future a bit. In our UK, I know it's a very different set of circumstances, but we are still living off the investments that were made in the 50s and 60s in the UK network. People built for the future then, and we are, largely living off some of that at least still. And so I think there's an element of that sort of foresighting that's needed. But if there's not those sorts of interventions, then sometimes these things will just run their course, as you say, and they can only support a certain amount of, like loads. It's not untypical for you to rate a system for people to add on the types of net loads that you're expecting, but then 3 people add televisions onto it, and it basically just trips the network. Or people want to put pressure cookers on it. There's a huge piece of work, on clean cooking in Africa, because a lot of people will still cook on biomass using charcoal and things like that, and so there's and quite often it's indoors, so you've got typically a lady cooking, 2 children hanging onto our legs, and they're in one room, and you know, there's, yeah, you want an alternative to that, basically. So there's a whole piece of work that is looking at that. But to try and bring these loads onto the grid, cooking loads, is quite a big challenge based on the ratings of the system. So if that's the direction that people want to move in, clean cooking and so forth, then you need to build the systems to accommodate them. So yeah, I think they're built to meet the requirements just now, and where appropriate, the investment they'll build for the future. But I'm not sure that you need a more coordinated approach to that, I think, for it to be really useful. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but...
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question, if there's anybody with a burning question. Otherwise, so thank you very much indeed for all of you to come here, and thank you to Stuart for the most interesting talk.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind invitation. Thank you.